If you want to read better and think more clearly and understand the ideas shaping our world, then this might be for you. You should join the Dr. John Patrick Book Club. It's a private online community where we read great books together and learn how to think, not just what to think. Inside, you're going to have access to Dr. John Patrick as we work through books and ask questions. If you've ever felt like there are books you should be reading or ideas that you want to understand better, but you didn't want to do it alone, this is a good place to start. You can find the link in the show notes or the description below to join.
Hello, folks. John Patrick again. For those who don't know me, the traditional description is erstwhile professor of biochemistry and pediatrics. Spent a lot of time, over 20 years, doing a lot of teaching in primarily Christian environments around the world on ethics, culture, faith, and public policy. So that's where I'm coming from. But this podcast, which was set up by Craig some time ago, I often jokingly say should be the podcast of the wandering mind, because what I do is talk about what I've been reading in the last little while. Usually that's the way it comes about. And this week there's quite a lot I've been reading that's I think might be of interest, especially as I find that some of the stuff I've been reading with interest, what surprises me is what they didn't know until recently. But that's the world we live in now. If you're not constantly in the public's eye, we don't have too many scholars around, do we? So my starting point for today was actually Acts 2:22, which I say to every student going to university who claims to be a Christian, if you want to hang on to your faith, and I strongly advise you to do so, make Acts 2:22 a kind of motif, a means of telling yourself how you're doing. It's what described the early church. They continued in the apostles' doctrine, breaking of bread, fellowship, and prayers. There are four things which the modern young person knows nothing about, and not surprisingly, they are lost because of it. The good news is that increasingly they know they are lost, and they are beginning to ask some of the right questions. I've read this before, but I'll read it again because I'd like it to soak into your minds. Because this is describing, I think, the modern student. Wherever someone knows that they are lost and cries for help to find a way back home and turns toward their Father's house at last, you are their way before they know your name. I think it's a lovely introduction to modern students, in effect. They know they're lost. It's not difficult to get them to come to terms with that. Yeah, life is meaningless to many of them. They know that they're supposed to go and get some sort of credentials, but they also know that they prefer learning on the job. In other words, ordinary kids are finding that finding a job with someone who knows what they're doing and how to do it is a much better way of learning for them than getting silly courses which are dominated by woke ideas that they can't relate to at all. Memorize and dump. That's what we've done to education. But for the early church, they had that passion. They continued in the apostles' doctrine. One of the most amazing experiences in my life was going to Africa to help a mission group with the problem of malnutrition, and finding that what the Africans appreciated most was not the work I did with the children, but the fact that I could explain the Bible in a way they understood, and particularly explain to them at least the beginnings of why development is so slow and why money is not the solution. Once they discovered I could bring that subject to life, they didn't want me to see patients. There they were hungry for the right thing. Now, it's going to be a long while before development happens in Africa. The minimum is 2 or 3 centuries from the arrival of Christianity to anything that looks like development as we understand it, and not to recognize that and not to teach that and show why it's true is disastrous. But the early church knew that they wanted what Jesus had said to be fixed in their minds, and they wanted it related to where they came from and pointing the way to where they were going. So the first thing in Acts 2:22 is they continued in the apostles' doctrine, logos, teaching. What did Jesus teach us about ourselves? What did he teach us about where we came from, where we're going? All those questions. And the early church didn't need somebody to say, how do we get them into church to listen to this or that? They came because their lives had been transformed. Whenever the Spirit of God gets to work, you don't have to ask people to church. They come. When you start doing advertising programs, there's a problem there. I mean, yes, you have to say that you're there. But when things happen in local communities, people know about it and they come. That's always been the way. Look at what happened to New England in the 18th century. What happened to England? What didn't happen to France? And there have been multiple examples of that. One of the things I read this week, actually, this is a throwaway line I wasn't intending to talk about, but it's something I'll come back to later because I'm still processing. It's a comment from O'Donovan where he says, in the history of recurrent renewals, where people get excited about their faith and they're willing to confess their sins. But what we fail to do time and time again is what Paul spends all his life doing. He said, okay, so you've repented. Now what are you going to do about it? How are you going to change your life to make it more worthy of your Savior? That's what Paul did. So Romans was basically to take an illiterate Roman crowd who needed to have some structure to their theology and teach them. Excuse me, I have to stop for one moment. I can't talk now, sorry. Can you call again in an hour? Sorry about that. Hopefully that the young lady in the Philippines who does the work to make it look nicer will be able to weed that out. Otherwise, just forgive me. You can't control who calls you these days, can you? So, what O'Donovan says is we didn't do the Paul thing. Corinthians, educate the Romans. That was Romans. Corinthians, they were out of control in behavior, particularly sexually. So he talked about that. The Thessalonians thought Jesus would come again so soon they didn't need to work. So he said, then you don't need to eat either. That's what he did every time. He grew and he wanted to grow the Christian mind. And he understood that it would show in the way we cared for one another. We don't do that. We don't discipline new Christians. Billy Graham said it towards the end of his life that if he did it again, a lot more effort would go into follow-up, because a big campaign in town excites everybody and a lot of people go forward for emotional reasons and it doesn't last very long. For some it does. For some it's mind-changing. But a lot more would be mind-changing if it was used as an opportunity to teach. So the early church, they had to do that. And of course, the demand led to them writing the Gospels and writing the epistles. It was logos-based. Now, the next thing, they continued in apostles' doctrine, breaking of bread. And I think that is the Lord's Supper, which became over time, for the Catholics, the Mass. And we don't talk about what's going on there enough. It's certainly more than just a memorial feast. You only have to look at your own responses to the Lord's Supper over time. I hope you've been there when it's been deeply meaningful in ways that are difficult to describe. It's important that we have parts of our lives that we acknowledge that we don't properly understand. So they did that. What Jesus told them to do, this is my body, this is my blood, they did it to remember him. And of course, much more came with it. So the apostles' doctrine, the breaking of bread, fellowship, that's what it attracted the world around them. Behold how these Christians love one another. If we don't love one another, we don't have a message. My parents, my father, who looked after my mother with dementia and didn't let her go into hospital to the end, was in effect adopted by two lovely young women from the church, single women who hadn't found a husband, and they found another dad instead and looked after him. He never had a Sunday meal alone in the years after the death of my mother. That's how churches should look after one another. We're going to have to think about how we do that, how we assist bringing that thing to life again. I mean, churches do it well, don't they? North America does it very well, and new people move in, especially the Americans more than the Canadians. Neighbors will bring food and things so when new people arrive to help them settle in. That's the early church was like that. That's a Christian throwback, if you like. So they continued in teaching, in the Lord's Supper, in fellowship, and in prayers. Prayer, we have sort of staccato prayers. Lord, give me this, this, and this, and what's some special this week. That's it. Well, it's an inadequate view of prayer, put it that way. Start with the Lord's Prayer every day. Say it twice. Ask God to stop you at a phrase, to be a point where you go to when you're about to be sucked into screen time or other useless activities. It will change your life. So that was the early church. It grew on that basis. Logos and the beginning of sacrament at some level was there right from the beginning. Now, over time, of course, the questions that really matter existentially come up all the while. There's a lovely article in the most recent issue of First Things for May by Ephraim Radner, who I really enjoy reading. It always makes me think. But he points out the question, why me? Why is my life so miserable? The early church didn't ask that. They were more stoical. They realized that life was tough. And Jesus, of course, hadn't modified that. He said, get used to the idea, in the world you will have trouble. Wow. That's not a very good sales point, is it? That's what he said. And the poor you will always have with you. That's going to be your ongoing problem. So how did they survive? Why did the church survive? Because they were joyful. Not in the way that we think about joy. If we want to be joyful, we start singing happy songs and jumping up and down and clapping our hands. He didn't say do that. It's the only beatitude that Jesus repeats in the list of beatitudes. He says this, in the repeat, he says, when you are persecuted and derided and blamed for my name's sake, be exceedingly glad. In other words, he thinks you can be exceedingly glad if you set your mind to it. So you're not talking about a transient up and down of your emotions. You're being persecuted, killed in many cases. But he said, be exceedingly glad. Why? Rationally, two good reasons. They did the same to me, so they'll do the same to you. And they did the same to the prophets who came before you. So you're in pretty good company. And your reward in heaven is very great. And those things were real. because people looked at what happened to the martyred Christians over the years, and the accounts are innumerable of how from Stephen onwards, they expected that Jesus would turn up for them when they were being persecuted in one way or another. And he did. It's a true statement that the blood of the martyrs is the growth of the church. That's what the early church understood. What we've forgotten. We have become so self-centered. And I want to talk now a little bit about how this came about. There's some good things about it at the moment being written, and I'm very hopeful that we'll get a deeper understanding of these things. Why me is the only question that the moderns have. Everything is about me, the entitlement generation. Why not me? Why should I be different? Why should I be excused from the human race, so to speak? Christians understood that. Here we have no abiding city, but we seek a city whose builder and maker is God. And the intimations of that can be very real. And we tend not to talk about them, but we ought to talk about them more. And that would come up in serious discussion of what a reasonable life would be. So what we have done is taken the ancients who lived in a world of trouble, as Jesus knew, and so they had a big list, the 9 questions, which you can find on previous podcasts if you're interested in following it up. But all the existential questions, particularly the 3 practical ones. How do I come to terms with death, suffering, and injustice? Now all we have from the students is social justice warriors who have received more, material wealth than any generation before them, more things, and yet they are more lost than any. They are the lost ones who, when they realize they're lost and start looking, they find, as Malcolm Guite puts it, they turn towards their Father's home before they know his name. That's true. Those that seek find. So we need to get the bigger questions back into discussion. The fact that school can assume that a woke agenda will make a meaningful life is it's pathetic, to say the least. So, that's our fault, because we don't talk about things. No proper discussion of the big questions of relationships, sex, life, death, suffering, injustice. When did you hear a sermon on those issues? There's plenty of it in the scriptures, but we pick and choose to have simple ones that don't get to us in the way they should. We are lost in the cosmos, as Walker Percy puts it, the last self-help book. If you want an amusing self-help book, Lost in the Cosmos by Walker Percy is worth reading. Now, how did this all happen? Well, the early church grew on the blood of the martyrs. It had no publicity campaign. It simply grew. It took over the whole Mediterranean because they loved one another and everybody wanted to be part of it. The Muslims took it over because they killed everyone and they had the sharpest swords and the best army. They both conquered the Mediterranean a few centuries apart, but they have very different consequences, very different methods. And Muslim young men are still thinking that they're going to rule the world. They're not going to rule the world. I doubt that Islam will last to the end of the century because its incoherences are being paraded on the internet. Missionaries made little impact on the Muslim world because they were able to keep lockdown in place, but they can't control the internet. And particularly women are seeing that their lives are miserable compared to the lives of other women, and they don't like it. And then they hear the gospel and its story of Christ's love for women as well as men, that he has a plan for us. And so conversions are happening throughout the Islamic world at a huge rate. Even Muslim leaders are saying we have a tsunami of apostasy. That's good news for them and for us. So how did it all come about? From that start from nothing and early persecution, which went on for centuries, but led to the establishment of the church. There was no structure to the church for a long while. Reading Paul's letters, one has a real sense that he's worried whether these churches are going to survive. And of course, not all of them did. And in John's letter, you read the letter to the church at Ephesus and you think, what a wonderful church, until you come to the last line. They have lost their first love. And Christ says to the church, if you do not repent, I will take your candlestick away. There's no church in Ephesus today where that letter was sent to. They apparently didn't repent. There are moral consequences in the world. So what happens to the church is really a question of what happens to each of us, because the church is the body of Christ in the world. And we have to read and pray and think and use Acts 2:42 as a means of enlivening ourselves. Now, you do find very interesting areas for discussion. One of them, we had some friends visiting for a couple of days, and one of them has a son in law school, or out of law school now, doing well, but having, as so often the case, lost any active faith and any active belief. I have a grandson who's somewhat similar, and they're in the legal system and they're going to be disenchanted. My grandson, who's very smart and got a nice sense of humor, understands irony. Right at the beginning of his law school, I sent him Arthur Leff's paper, which, if you've got a young lawyer in your family and they haven't been confronted with Arthur Leff, you should send it to them. Arthur Leff on Justice, Duke Law Review 1979, will find it. Its opening paragraph is stunning. I want to believe, and so do you, complete immanent means accessible to you, understandable, complete immanent and transcendent from God set of rules to direct us how to live our lives righteously. Now, as far as I can discover, Leff was an unbelieving Jew, but he wanted Torah to be from God so that it was authoritative and accessible to us. But he goes on, but I also want to believe in no such thing, but rather we are wholly free to decide for ourselves what we ought to do and what we ought to be. What we want, heaven help us, is to be simultaneously perfectly ruled and perfectly free. That is at the same time to discover the right and the good and to invent it. Can't have both. And we've chosen invention where we should have recognized discovery. He then writes 20 pages of lucid prose, unlike most academics. And if you don't read anything else, read the last 2 paragraphs. And then ask your legal family members what they make of it. Most of them will want to push it away. But be a little cantankerous, hold on to it. I've reached the stage with Isaac, who told me initially, well, the law is just procedural. But last year we had a conversation just after he'd got married. He doesn't believe, I don't know whether his wife believes or not, but they got married because her mum wanted a marriage and she's dying of cancer, so they got married. Amazingly, they had an Anglican service in a private chapel, so to speak. At the end of the evening, I happened to say goodbye to my grandson, and I said, was that a purely procedural evening? He's got a good sense of humor. He had a wry smile, and he said, no, Grandad, it's not. And neither is justice. He knows. He's been watching now, and he'll go on watching because he's a smart kid. And he's honest, so he's not going to pretend they're doing good things when they're doing bad. And he's articling in the Supreme Court this coming year, so he's going to see some of the worst judges in Canada, I'm afraid, but that will be good for him. So if you've got lawyers in your family, confront them. So where do we go from here? Well, that start didn't continue in the same way. But when Constantine came along and the Roman Empire was forcibly converted to Christianity, God was in it, so it has to be good at one level. But clearly, once the government decides that the church matters, the church becomes invaded by people with careers and objectives and not the right ones. That's inevitable. That's what human nature does. It's called politics. And so the church had to start dealing with politics, and it's been dealing with it ever since, right up to the present day. Not just liberals and traditional Protestants, but the Catholic Church has exactly the same problems. And the current Pope has taken it on. I'm watching with interest, but there's a war going on. Do a set of sacraments literally performed, constitute what happens when the Lord comes to meet with you? It can do, but it doesn't. We are not in control of that. Now, what's going to happen? I don't know. I'm watching it, and I find it very, very interesting. So politics came into the church, and you should always remember that all human organizations are political. And until you know their ends, they're hard to interpret. We saw that with the Hutu and the Tutsi totally outmaneuvered the Hutu, although they're the minority tribe, but they are the astute ones. That they'd lost in a previous battle. They've been fighting forever. The Tutsi had been around the world, got educated, and they managed to persuade the world that they were the victims. Even at one point, cynically showing mass graves, one of which was full of Hutus that they had killed. But how were the journalists going to tell the difference? They were not going to go close. You could tell the difference quite easily if you knew what you're looking for. That's politics. That's the way it works. Power. So the church has got to stand against that at some level, and we don't do it well. But power can't snuff out faith. Faith comes along and does what it does, and they can't stop. They couldn't stop the 18th century revivals. We need some more, but unfortunately, we need a lot more teaching. So what we've got is a very rapid growth south of the equator of a Pentecostal approach to faith, which is good, it meets people where they are, but there's no teaching going on. They hold their hands in the air and wave them around for a bit and then confess their sins, often with tears, and they may go and say sorry to the people they've sinned against, but no one is then sitting them down and doing what Paul did. Said, now, what are you going to do? How are you going to deal with this behavior? You've got to do it by putting to death the deeds of the flesh with the aid of the Spirit. You don't ask the Spirit to set you free. You do ask that. But you understand that the Spirit is going to work through you to achieve good ends. Romans 8. If you, through the Spirit, put to death the deeds of the flesh, you will flourish. Now, what we're getting now is, in our medical world, for instance, is the consequences of forgetting that completely. The big change in patients coming to see the doctor in my lifetime is in causation. When I started internal medicine, very few patients had any guilt element to the reason they came. They had hypertension or diabetes or whatever it was. They didn't feel guilty about it. Now, in an inner city, almost all patients coming to see the doctor are coming with a problem that has a huge element of behavior. You cannot get overweight if you do not eat too many calories. There were literally zero fat people in the concentration camps. There is a level of intake at which you balance. If you're disciplined, you live within that, in that range. Now, most people are not eating for nutrition. They're eating for other reasons. Desire, compulsion almost. It can easily become that. You see that. So sexually transmitted disease has gone through the roof in my lifetime. That's courtesy of the pill. How anyone could presume that you could separate sex from reproduction and not have much more sex, and with it, inevitably, much more sexually transmitted disease. I have to call it infections now because disease upsets people. Truth is truth. It should be spoken. It's not a disease that you caught. It's a disease that you went and got by what you did. And you should have been taught that in school, but you aren't. The condom fails, let's say even 5% of the time, and sexually transmitting disease rates are going up, then you've got a 1 in 20 chance of the condom failing, and you've got who knows what risk when you're having almost unknown sex, sometimes unconscious sex. The results are inevitable, and guilt is part of them. When pregnancy comes along despite contraception, well, we have to have a backup plan, which is what the American Roe v. Wade decision said, because American women have become used to control over pregnancy, and when it fails, then we must have a backup plan because they must have their feelings met. But even now, you have people like Ferguson in New Zealand, as far as I can gather, a liberal psychiatrist who says, I've had enough of it. I see far too much depression that's rooted in guilt over abortion. Of course there should be. It is a baby, we were all like that at some stage. If we weren't honoured then, we won't be honoured later, as is happening, isn't it? It's inevitable. The whole construction, physician-assisted killing, is inevitable once you've accepted abortion. There's a logical, rational route all the way through. If you believe there is no God, you will do all these things. That's the world we live in. It's morally consequential. Now, some people recognize this a long way back, and I can't remember who wrote this. He was writing to Adlai Stevenson, who was one of the smartest politicians in, I guess, the 60s. So he wrote to Adlai Stevenson, "Mainly, my dear Adlai, I am perturbed by the cynical immorality of our nation. If I wish to destroy a nation and a people, I would make it rich and powerful and self-interested. Strange creatures we are, we can stand anything that God may send upon us, save only plenty." If you find who sent that letter, send me a note so that I can add it to my list that I used to keep in my head, and I now have to store names on bits of paper. Fortunately, I still remember the quotations, which tells you something about how localized some things are in the brain, and the bit of the brain, the little gremlin who's in charge of the filing system has been playing games in my mind on that one. So that's who we are. We are in moral decay. Everybody knows that. And you've got to do what you can for your children. When did this all start? Well, as I said, I think Constantine didn't help because it led to there being good material reasons for wanting to be in the church. And throughout the history of the church, there's plenty of evidence that there are people who use the church for their own purposes, and Lord have mercy on their souls. Becoming a pope doesn't make you perfect, but it gives you lots of special ways of showing your imperfections. It's dangerous. But by and large, the great gift to Britain over the centuries, being an island, it helped. Once the gospel got there in the first century with the other Augustine, but it was some time later, that around the 6th century, that it got reconverted after the Danes and the rest of the wild pagans, Norsemen, had ravaged the country and added some genes to it as well. And conversion occurred. Again, reconversion in the historical sense. But it was centuries before Christian government emerged that could be seen to be clearly influenced by Christianity. And the starting point was Alfred, the greatest king we ever had, in my view. And the great gift he gave was common law, which Americans share with us, and the Commonwealth shares an amazing insight on how to do the law. Now, I should talk about that some other time, not now, but common law is an astonishingly flexible instrument, and it puts the power not to make law, but to say no to law in the hands of ordinary people, where it must be at the end of the day. We've got to stop this rule by lawyers, because they're not in any way better than the rest of us, and they have far more opportunity to do evil, and they're perfectly willing to do it. Political ends for them and for all people, but their problem is that they can do things, and they do. We need to take back the power at that level. So Alfred and his sons established a system of law which was rooted in the Old Testament. Alfred actually translated some bits of the Old Testament and the New for his people. He understood that the king in the Jewish system had to read the Torah every year, in theory. Whether they did or not, they certainly didn't let it have all the action it should have. But the Jews in the process learned that education doesn't make you good. It simply makes you more sophisticated. Goodness is an entirely different phenomenon. And we don't talk about it in school. The best way, of course, is reading great literature, because it takes a great artist to show the nuances of a good life. And how very hard to write a good book about a good man or a good woman. It can be done. And the great surge in interest in Jane Austen is hopeful in some ways. So the medieval church, many priests didn't even have a copy of the Bible. It was read Charles Taylor, if you're interested in the history. The service that was most attended was the one where they marched around the bounds of the parish to pray for a good harvest, and that has some pagan roots. So the story was there. It wasn't flourishing, but it was the default, and it created a culture. Don't ever talk about racism, talk about culture. You can't talk about racism without being a racist. I mean, to accuse somebody of racism is to be racist yourself. That isn't the way to go. You should be talking to them about being dishonest or unfair or unkind or unjust. Talk about their culture, the way they live. They would refuse to talk about racism. It is a red herring in the first order. And until you've got rid of tribal racism, you cannot possibly develop, because those societies, those cultures always put loyalty to immediate family and clan over truth. So the bit of Africa we know well, the money was given by the European Union to put a road down the eastern side of Zaire several times. It always got eaten on the way. And that's not wrong in their culture. If you have money in your hand and your brother needs something, you give him some. But it means that infrastructure doesn't happen. That's where we're at. So Lewis, at the end, in The Abolition of Man, says this. He says, I'm putting two bits together, as my grandson pointed out to me. I thought they came together, but they come in different parts. But they fit together beautifully. So I hope C.S. Lewis will forgive me, and one day we can perhaps even talk about it. But he says, for the wise men of old, the cardinal problem of human life is how to conform your soul to objective reality, which is God. And the solution was wisdom, self-discipline, and virtue. For the modern man, the primary objective of modern life is to conform reality to our desires, and the solution is technique. Nobody can put those two things together and say, that's us. Nobody can avoid that conclusion. That's who we are. And the techniques are taking control of us, aren't they? Those of you with teenage children know that they are controlled by their phone, not by you. Phones are destroying the younger generation. They're destroying us. Even what I'm doing now, which will appear on YouTube, can become addictive. I don't think I can become addictive, but YouTube can, and screens in general can. I can diminish my concentration span by watching trivial stuff that I'd be better off not watching. And I try and control that. The thought of reading for 5 hours, which is what I did routinely every day during the summer holidays pretty well, is unthinkable to most modern kids. Because I had no distractions. We had no television. We did listen to 5 o'clock children's hour every. We would run home from school, but my wife and I remember running home from school, so not to miss the episode that we wanted to hear in children's hour. Of course, children's hour like that doesn't exist anymore. It's dangerous. It might teach them to think in a way that the woke elite don't want. Fortunately, they can't hold it down forever. Hopefully, some progress is being made with charter schools, with Christian schools. But we've lost a lot of ground. We can't get back to where we want in less than 2 or 3 generations, I don't think. I hope I'm wrong. So the terrible price has been paid, starting with what became materialism. Now, I've told this story in previous podcasts, so I'm not going to do it all now, but basically what happened was around the 13th century, I don't think most people go back far enough, deductive logic had arrived back in Europe around the 10th, 1100s, 1200s, and led to the foundation of the universities and changed the teaching. And then it was temporarily banned because the bishop in Paris, anyway, the Bishop of Paris was worried that this new teaching might undermine the faith of the humble poor. And he's right, he could easily do so and does. But that's not a reason for stopping it. It's a reason for teaching it better. But they couldn't do it because the bishop controlled the university. So they could still do inductive reasoning, which is the basis, intellectual basis for an experiment. If you don't believe that there's structure, you don't go looking for it. If you believe that the world is arbitrarily controlled by Allah, then there's no reason to do experiments, is there? Because he can do whatever he wishes. Whereas we are taught that God has a character, and we can learn about that character, that he is reliable, that he is rational. He is super-rational as well. That gives you reason to do experiments. And it took off. In the 14th century, the first real experiments were done, and we all know what happened. In a very, very short time, the world was changed dramatically. We began for the first time in the history of the world to have control over nature, but not over our own nature. That remained as it always was. But it did lead to the scientific elite practicing scientism, which is believing that science can answer all the questions. That's not a good idea. Excuse me, I missed. Oh my goodness, time does fly. That's not a good idea. But it's what we had. And I remember going to university where it was routine to make snide comments about people who didn't realize that Darwin had changed our understanding of how we came about, etc., etc. So the world fell apart basically because of 4 areas of science, not just that one. Thermodynamics did the same, because Aristotle rightly thought that the best solution to the creation problem was an eternal universe. What thermodynamics did by the demonstration of entropy showed that the universe was running downhill and would end, as if nothing happens in between, in total frozen waste, with 1 element every square meter or cubic meter or something like that. Nothing. It's going downhill. So if it's not going downhill, where did the energy come from? Thermodynamics makes an eternal universe unthinkable. Therefore, how did it come about? Did it spontaneously, which some people still hang on to? They prefer spontaneous generation. Real scientists prefer spontaneous generations and say so to a creator. That's not rational. That's running away from something you don't want. The next thing that came along, of course, was the expanding universe. And that's just getting worse and worse for them. As instead of getting simpler, the further back you go, it's getting more complex. And then the thing that bothered Hawking more than anything else, the fine-tuning of the universe. I mean, he was obsessed by it. How could such fine-tuning come about? I mean, Planck's constant, always forget how many zeros are after the decimal point before you get to a number, or at least you get to numbers at that level in describing it, out by 1 at 0.601, shall we say, which is going to be about right. We wouldn't be here. That's how fine-tuned our universe is. Out by 0.601%, we wouldn't be here. That stops most physicists in their tracks. And finally, of course, molecular genetics has destroyed Darwin. Darwin was incredibly powerful. It suited the materialistic mindset. It justified radical capitalism and radical Marxism. Thank God we now know it is not true. There is a designer behind the universe. The probability of DNA happening by chance is 0. It didn't happen by chance. That ought to be taught in school. There's no rational possibility that it did. So there is a mind, or something like a mind, behind the universe. That's the world we're in now. And what it's led to, of course, is the lostness of the current generation. The techniques have taken over, and the next generation might be even worse before we claw back. I don't know whether we will or not. It's good to see some people, like at the top end of the spectrum, saying we've got to step back. People who are becoming Christian because they see that it's the only way forward. People like Ferguson and his wife, Shiali, Tom Holland, recent examples, but there are many of them. And Mary Harrington, the erstwhile lesbian, now writing for First Things quite frequently. There are lots of them out there, people deconstructing sexuality and looking at the fact that most of the world is dying out. I mean, China is not a problem. The question is how long it will be capable of causing trouble. But you cannot come back from a one-child policy for 20 years and start up again. They simply don't have the manpower to do it, literally manpower, and women power too. But the men are the problem. And of course, when you have 8 children, you can be proud of the one who dies in battle. But when the continuation of your family is the most important thing to you, you don't want to send one son to get killed. It's a political problem that the PCC has not yet dealt with, and it will deal with them instead. I mean, they have a younger generation who are shrugging their shoulders and saying, what's the point? That's happening around the world. It's happening to us too. I mean, we're nowhere near replacement rate. So what's going to happen? Well, the people who have children will rule if they educate them as well. Now, serious Christians are having, on average, 3 children. If we had 4 or 5, it would be even better. Orthodox Jews are having 7 or 8. They're going to be a serious voting bloc in the States. Now, Muslims are still having babies, but 25% of them have left Islam by their teenage years. So they're facing the same problem in actual fact, but they can deny it for the moment by pretending that the moment you're born, you're a Muslim for life. That's no longer true with the internet. So there's lots to think about today, isn't there? Go away, practice Acts 2:42, and start asking the right questions. And somebody, find out who it was that wrote to Adlai Stevenson and send me the reference. I'd love to meet you all, but that's not an option. But I meet some of you, and it's a great pleasure. And I do really appreciate your emails. So God bless you all.